Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, where we take you back to the good old days, just maybe not exactly how you expect from our title. I am Megan Cox.
And I am Clayton Becker.
And Clayton, what are we going to be talking about today after our nice long hiatus due to my total lack of voice?
Yes, I apologize to everyone that we are coming to you a week later than we wanted to. Megan completely lost her voice, sent me a voice memo being like, "This is what my voice sounds like." It was so bad that I literally can't even
You can't fake.
Yeah, I can't even fake how bad it was. Yeah, it was pretty bad.
Well, don't hurt yourself. But what are we talking about today?
Yes, we are rejecting born and raised and embracing transplants.
Okay.
Now, I know this seems perhaps a little bit provocative. We couldn't really think of a less provocative way to put the first half of the title here. But basically what we're trying to reject here, the thing that we want to get people to think about at the very least, is getting rid of this distinction between long-term residents of a place and people who arrived recently. Getting rid of this idea that if you were born and raised in a city, then you are somehow a superior citizen of that place to people who moved there later in life for whatever reason. Right?
You have some sense of additional credibility in a place because you've lived there longer.
Yes. I think we'll talk about all of the various manifestations of this in just a little bit, but just at the outset, right? I want to state that I do not think that people shouldn't be allowed to live where they grow up, right? The double negative might be a little hard there, so let me state it without the double negative. I think people should be able to live where they grew up. It's just that I also
think that makes sense. I think a lot of us, if we are people who have,
sorry, it's just so I also think that people should be able to move to new places, and the problem that we are experiencing right now is that there seems to be a bifurcation of those two kinds of person. Right? There's this zero-sum game that everyone is sort of attaching themselves to, where people think that in order for transplants to be able to move to a new place, then people who grew up there must lose out. They must be forced out because there's this sort of zero-sum game. And this is true whether we're talking about people's perceptions of jobs or housing or culture or traffic or really anything that you could sort of imagine people talking about when they think of the effects of transplants.
I think that's a really good point. I think we tend to kind of take on the identity of one side or another of this, depending on our personal experience with it. If you are someone like me who has spent a lot of time moving around the city they grew up in and are aware of the fact that the neighborhoods that your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents lived in are completely inaccessible to you now financially for whatever reason, it is easy to take on without really realizing you're doing it some of these arguments against transplants. And so thinking about all of these arguments that you're going to make here today about how we connect in our brain, the idea that it's not necessarily zero sum. These are the assumptions that we're making. And then what kind of policies we can adopt to make things better for everyone, not one group or another. I think they're going to be really useful for a lot of us.
Yeah. So I also want to state at the outset here that I also find this discourse to be extremely internally inconsistent in a lot of ways, in ways that I find deeply annoying, quite frankly. But the most prominent way, and the way that I want to really sort of begin our discussion here, is you have lots of people who fully recognize that we should allow immigrants into the country, both on economic and humanitarian grounds. Many of those same exact people are completely insane about this when it comes to transplants. When it comes from people who are immigrants, but are just immigrating from their own country, right?
Internally, yeah.
Yeah, transplants are just another type of immigrant. They just didn't have to cross a border to get here, right? And so, like, when you hear the word transplant in your brain, you should think, this person is another type of immigrant, right? And so if you ever sort of want to understand, and you don't understand as someone like center left to left wing, right? Like how people on the right could be so completely and utterly vitriolic and so completely and utterly insane about immigrants, just listen to how people talk about transplants sometimes, right? It's many of the exact same themes and the exact same arguments. Now, of course, there are, like, I would argue, sort of variations on this theme of, like, transplants are bad and evil. There's, like, you know, people who sort of merely enjoy the lack of traffic during, like, festival season or during the holidays, right? When people go and visit family members elsewhere in the country, during Coachella, when lots of people leave Los Angeles for a couple of weekends in a row, right? You know, I find this, like, moderately annoying because, like, it comes out of a place of, I think, like, genuine dislike for the people who have moved to the city, but it's, like, mostly innocuous. And to be fair, like, many of them aren't connecting it to the transplants. They're just enjoying that they have, like, wide open freeways for a weekend, right? Then there are people who, you know, think that transplants have just like a more pressing responsibility to give back to their new communities. I also find this one, like, moderately okay, right? This one is mostly fine, partly because it's something that, like, transplants themselves often believe, right? And also, as we are on this show, big fans of just pro-social behavior in general, I find this one largely harmless, even if it does come out of this, like, idea that transplants are somehow, like, less validly in a place than people who just happened to be born there.
They have to earn their place in a community through proactive giving back. Whereas if my family has lived in a neighborhood for generations, I don't have to do that because I already have my family has in some way contributed its share already.
Yeah, and there are, like, so many things I could say about that. Like, number one, do not tell me about what your ancestors did. You don't get credit for them, right? Like, if we're not going to blame people for the sins of their ancestors, you don't get credit for, like, the good things that your ancestors did. But then also, you know, like, this is, again, sort of just like a lottery of birth story. It really is, right? Like, you had the good fortune to be born in a place that people want to move to. People want to move to that place for a reason. And in many instances, your parents or grandparents also moved there, right? So it's like you are only not a transplant by virtue of, like, when you were born in the generational chain, right? So again, I find this to be, like, mostly fine, mostly innocuous. But then there are the people who think that transplants, like, people just moving to a new city, are fundamentally a bad thing for the cities they are moving to, and think they should not be allowed to do so, or that they should have to leave. And, like, quite frankly, this discourse gets completely insane in a lot of ways very, very quickly. Like, I was born in Portland, as were you, Megan, right? I moved to Southern California at 8 years old with my family. Like, obviously, as an 8-year-old, I had no say in the matter, right? And I have still had people describe me personally for moving to SoCal as an 8-year-old as a gentrifier. And I'm like, if we're describing small elementary, I was in 2nd grade, right? If we're describing 2nd graders as gentrifiers at this point, I think maybe we've lost the plot a little bit. In the same way that, like, right-wingers who are very, very anti-immigrant talk about, like, immigrant children as people who are going to, like, grow up to be murderers, right? Like, it's completely insane, absolutely batshit crazy. And it, like, really, really fucks with you when you see people actually doing it out in the wild. I think, like, this discourse just describes transplants as being, like, foundationally illegitimate residents. That, like, they cannot and do not belong in the city. And people who fall into this camp usually, but not always, fall into one or more of the following belief categories. We'll go over them just like straight up, and then we'll talk about each of them in turn. 1, transplants should not move there at all. 2, people should have to literally receive permission from the state in order to move somewhere. 3, leave, conditional on the fact that they are already there. And 4, laws should be passed to make it harder for people to move to a new city. And 5, procedures should be put in place that essentially mean incumbent residents have a veto over new neighbors. Usually people who fall into this anti-transplant discourse end up believing one or more of these things. And I've sort of structured them, I think, from like the most common to like the least common beliefs. So let's talk about this first one, that they just believe transplants shouldn't move there. Like it's this sort of moral belief that they have about like transplants should stay where they were born and improve the place that they grew up, right? Again, very similar argument to what people argue about immigrants coming from other parts of the world.
It is striking, the similarities
it really is.
there.
It's the same theme. It really is. People will like describe you as somehow morally bankrupt for having like the audacity to move or to be moved, right? And also to this point, people like sometimes have such an expansive definition of what it means to be a transplant that the term becomes like essentially meaningless, right? For instance, I have seen people both in person and online, more frequently online, I'll grant you, but seen people who say that someone moving from like Encino down to like Koreatown is a transplant. Now, Megan, I don't know how familiar you got with the geography of LA while you were here. Maybe you'll become a little more familiar once you move back for the next couple of years.
I'm good on the west side, but everything else is a little...
So, Encino is like on the other side of the Hollywood Hills. It is like verging like from in the hills down into like the flatlands of the valley, right? It's like one of the farthest south neighborhoods in the San Fernando Valley. The Valley, for those of you. The Valley, yeah. Koreatown is a mid-city neighborhood in Los Angeles between like the west side and downtown. It's one of the denser parts of LA. It's one of the areas where like almost all of the residential land area is actually zoned for apartments. And so lots of apartment construction has happened there over the last 25 years or so. Importantly though, right? Encino and Koreatown are approximately 15 miles apart. They are 30 minutes apart driving. And you have people who will describe folks moving from Encino to Koreatown as being transplants. People who are moving from one part of LA proper to another part of LA proper, and who are describing the people who are moving as being transplants. I guess, to me, this makes the term like fundamentally useless.
And what is the alternative as well? Like it's a very silly situation because they're so close. They're within the same state, within the same city. So it's very, it's a silly argument, but like, what is these people's alternative, particularly in the context of housing cost? Because I anticipate, as you said, that Koreatown is primarily zoned for apartments, and there are a lot of apartments being built. I don't know if Encino is primarily single-family housing, but I would anticipate that it is going to be more expensive, and that's why people are moving from Encino to Koreatown, right? So your alternative, if you're telling people not to move, is don't afford a house or a place to live, or what? What are we doing here?
Well, so this is where it's like really internally inconsistent, right? Like there is no alternative.
Yeah.
Right? Like when people like grow up and they have to like leave their parents' house in Encino, they have to move somewhere, right? Not only because we don't really build much new housing in the Encino neighborhood, because it is like zoned, I would say conservatively, probably like 90% for single family homes. It's one of the wealthier neighborhoods in Los Angeles, right? There isn't an alternative. You have to either allow people to build more housing in Encino, which I also think is something we should do, right? But you either have to allow people to build more housing in Encino, or those people who were raised in Encino have to move elsewhere if they're not moving to Koreatown, right? Which also just gets us into like another can of worms that I don't like really, really want to get into. But it's like, oh, well, they can just go and move somewhere else, right? They don't have to move to our neighborhood. They can move to another neighborhood that they can afford, right? Which is just a little bit like, I don't know. It's like really intellectually inconsistent. You're just like, they should be a transplant somewhere else. I don't want them to be a transplant here. In its most extreme form, this manifests in a belief that's sort of like similar in at least its underlying logic to the Chinese hukou system. This is the second part of it. This is the like belief that people should have to receive permission from the state to move somewhere else. The hukou system in China is a household registration system. And that registration is tied to a specific locality. It's tied to a specific municipality. And it determines access to various public benefits. So it determines access to things like education, healthcare, housing subsidies, pensions, so on and so forth. And migrants who move from rural areas, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you or perhaps the audience, like China is rapidly urbanizing, right? Migrants who move from rural areas to cities often cannot transfer that registration, which leaves them without equal access to schools, medical care, and social services in the city that they've moved to. In effect, this system quite literally does create like tiers of citizenship within the same country based on where you are registered, and that registration is based on where you are born. And you have people in the United States who like look at transplants and say that like the fundamental freedom of movement that we enjoy in the United States should be curtailed, and people should have to have their like reasons for moving be adjudicated before they are like allowed to move to a new place, particularly if that place is like currently experiencing gentrification or displacement pressures, right? So there's like a maybe moderately understandable concern behind this belief, but the belief itself is like totally insane, I think. And you see like the same kind of like anti-transplant rhetoric we see here in the States be used in China to justify the hukou system. Like, they're justified using rhetoric that is about protecting resources for locals. Like in Beijing, for instance, it's really common to have people like argue that this system is necessary because it will protect residents from being overwhelmed by rural migrants. And in US cities, opposition to new housing or like new commercial developments is often framed as preventing outsiders from straining schools or roads or community character, or in a like sort of backwards jujitsu move where they misunderstand the economics here as making it so that housing prices don't go up. Which is to me like completely kind of insane, right? It's just completely backwards. And like the growth of this kind of rhetoric has me like deeply concerned and worried, quite frankly. I don't like it. I don't like it one bit.
Yeah, it's a very, limited way of looking at public resources. It is zero sum. We're going to keep saying this phrase, I would imagine, to say we have a certain number of places in schools, we have a certain number of jobs, we have a certain number of apartments or houses, and it's going to create pressure if people want to move to our community. I think if we're talking about misunderstanding the economics or misunderstanding the dynamics of a situation like this, if people are wanting to move to an area, it is for a reason either that it's already very desirable, or possibly more likely they are filling a vacuum. Housing costs are low, so they're moving to a place where they can afford the housing, etc. So in some cases, you have these urban environments, because in the US, at least, we had generations of white flight and urban kind of hollowing of our urban centers. And then we have people kind of filling that back in. And that's primarily what you see when you're talking about gentrifying. At the same time, our schools are shrinking progressively. There is space in the schools, and it's a matter of reallocation of resources to say that we have the facilities. The facilities haven't been particularly well maintained. Maybe we need to hire more teachers, but we can move resources around. There's no reason that all of these resources need be as fixed as we think that they are if we're making an argument that locals should get first dibs on resources.
Yeah, there's also something I think like deeply disingenuous about the education argument in particular, which is that there will be lots of people, like lots of like ultra NIMBYs, or what we sometimes call bananas, the people who say build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, the bananas.
Never heard that.
Who will oppose like expanding schools, right? Who will be like, I don't want the construction in my neighborhood. I don't want the extra traffic that this will bring. Like, I don't want them to add another wing to this building or another floor to this building or what have you, right? And then those exact same people, when there's housing that's produced nearby, right? Or is proposed nearby, right? I suppose I should say, they'll then make the argument the schools don't have the capacity to handle a new influx of students. So they have created the situation in which the school is already straining for resources. And then they use that fact that the school is strained to justify not building any more housing, right? So they create the conditions that make it harder to accept new residents. And then they say, look, we can't accept any new residents. We're full. Look at the schools. So it's like, it's deeply, deeply disingenuous. And I think that's where like the second piece of this comes in, which is people believing that transplants should leave, conditional on the fact that they are already there. They've already moved there. I think this one sort of less frequently like tangibly manifests itself as policy proposals or like, you know, people actually trying to get the government to do something. But I think it really does result in a like more balkanized political environment where longtime residents like actively avoid transplants, view them as suspicious, like rarely find common cause with them to try to affect public policy in other arenas, and like actively try to avoid making friends with people who didn't grow up there. I think you mentioned something that I hadn't heard of, but the
Seattle freeze.
Yes, the phrase makes sense.
Yes.
What is the Seattle freeze, Megan?
So it's just kind of an observation from people who move to Seattle that it's very hard to make friends with people once you have moved to Seattle. And I think some of this has been attributed to a hesitancy to socially engage with transplants. And I have heard tell, though I don't know that it has a similar name, of a phenomenon that is like that in Portland as well, where it's hard to make friends with people when you move to this city. I don't know. I have never moved to Seattle and I grew up in Portland, so I haven't experienced these things. But I think there may be a social phenomenon where people find it difficult to move to a new city in a political environment where people are wary of quote unquote gentrification versus other cities that seem to be a bit more, I guess, equipped to handle a large inflow and outflow of people. And honestly, the city that comes to mind when I think of that is Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think there's also something to note here, which is that, like, very directly, there are fewer transplants than there used to be, right? Like, there are actually fewer transplants in most of America's large cities than there were, like, at least as a share of population throughout the middle of the 20th century. And this really comes down, what this comes down to is the fact that fewer people are moving than ever before. Like, the number of people who move in any given year has been decreasing, basically monotonically, since the late 1970s. Back in the 1970s, as much as like 25 to 30% of the population moved in any given year. People were moving all the time, right? And nowadays, in like 2024, the last year that we have like actual complete data for, that number is more like 13 or 14%, or maybe like 15%, which I know it was in 2019, sorry. Very few people are moving, and also like approximately 80% of all of these moves are local moves. They're like within the same county, right? So like very, very few people are actually moving from a place that they grew up to somewhere that's really far away in any given year. And yet
the average American, really quick, the average American distance lived from one's parents is 18 miles. That's you live maybe half an hour from your parents for most people, that's the average. So we're probably not seeing a bunch of families moving all together from metropolitan area to metropolitan area. We're seeing people not leave their metropolitan area and moving, as you say, within county or within region.
And so in this environment that we find ourselves in, where we have fewer transplants than ever before, it's much easier to look at that smaller group of people and then say, oh, those folks are the problem, right? Whereas in our parents' or grandparents' generation, every other fucking person was a transplant, right? Every other person had moved from somewhere else, right? And so,
Yes.
this is especially true for states on the West Coast, right? Like, in the middle of the century, the middle of the 20th century, more Californians were born outside of California than were born in California, right? And this was true for 60 years, right? And only in 2020 has it no longer been the case. There are more people from the United States who were born in California who live in California than people from the United States who were born elsewhere in the United States who live in California as of the 2020 census. First time it's been that way in like 60, 70 years. And a lot of the reason for that is that it's really, really expensive for people to live in California because we haven't built any fucking housing. And we haven't built any fucking housing because people are like, God damn, all these transplants, right? Even though there are less of them. It's an entirely backwards like idea and philosophy. But to that point of like, we haven't actually built any of this housing, right? This brings us to the third thing, or I guess maybe the fourth thing. I can't remember the order of these at this point, which is the idea
I think your list got mixed up.
Yeah, that laws should be passed to make it harder for people to move to a new city, or that laws should be passed to make it easier for people to stop new stuff from getting built to accommodate newcomers.
I got great news for these people because we've got a lot of those laws already.
Yeah, right. Like this is, I think, the most like clearly policy oriented piece of this, right? Like this kind of thing looks like really strict down zonings, growth caps, urban growth boundaries, preventing new businesses from opening, like opening big corporate headquarters or opening new plants or whatever. Like it's literally trying to ensure that the city actually can't accommodate new arrivals, right? And you see this both in like cities as well as like areas that are like really hurting and like need these new businesses, right? Like there are stories that I've read in the news from like Michigan and Wisconsin recently where like, someone proposed opening like, I think it was a battery manufacturing plant, that would have provided a couple thousand jobs to people in this sort of like quasi-ex-urban, quasi-rural area. And a whole bunch of like old farts showed up at the community meetings and were like, we don't want this to be built here. And it's like, well, then fuck me, Earl. Like, you want more manufacturing jobs? Where do you think they come from? They come from the manufacturing factory. Like
manufacturing for thee, but not for me.
Literally, it's completely bizarre, right? Like you have people who like seemingly are just determined to make sure that cities don't grow, that their city stays exactly the same as it was when they were like young or a child or moved there or whatever, right? And so you have all of these people who are like trying to encase their city in amber. And as a result, the like built environment stays largely the same, but the actual people who I would argue are more important to making up a city, like that doesn't remain the same. People are displaced, right? Like it's all.
I want to quickly note, the built environment doesn't stay the same because all of this takes maintenance and all of it takes people who care. I mean, I live down the street from an elementary school that's probably more than 100 years old. That requires maintenance. That requires a tax base to pay for it, and taxpayers who either have kids in school or care about kids in school. If you are dead set on stagnating your cities in that way, your built environment will not stay the same. It will get worse.
Yeah, that's true. The built environment stays
So
the
these
same.
people are dumb, bad, and wrong in more ways than we think.
Yeah, it stays the same in that the structures are the same, right? But the structures are decaying over time. They're depreciating. Yes. This is another sort of aside point that I haven't found the time to make on this podcast before, but I'll do it right now, which is even in areas with no population growth, you actually do need a somewhat decent clip of new housing production just to maintain the existing base of homes. And in places where the population is stagnant, you still have a need for more households, like more homes, more units, because household size has declined over time. You have people who, move out and move 18 miles away from their parents, right? People who move a couple miles away from their parents within the same city, right? Population has stayed the same, but there are multiple households that you now need to accommodate, right? And so, like, even in areas where
that
the population...
makes sense. And something else I want to note about this. Okay, so what I want to say about this is, in any place, you are going to need more houses than you have people, or more accommodations than you have people, because not all units in the housing stock are going to be occupiable at the same time. I think a lot of people don't think about this. I had a conversation once with a hotel manager, and they're like, this is terrible. We're sold out every night for months on end. I'm like, what are you talking about? How is that not a good thing? He says, we got to do repairs at some point. We have to close a room down to fix things, and we can't do that. So things are deteriorating. So you need more housing than you think, in more ways than you think, in order to maintain the same population.
Yeah, and there's things like frictional vacancies, and we could go down a whole ass rabbit hole here.
Yeah.
But anyway, the long story short is that you really do need to be you have to have these kinds of policies that are able to accommodate new residents just to accommodate your own existing population, right? The policies are functionally the same. And yet you have a lot of people who, and this is our last thing, our thing number 5, that procedures should be put in place that essentially mean that incumbent residents have a veto over new neighbors. You see this in things like pushes for local control when it comes to big housing debates, right? You saw this really clearly with regard to SB 79 in California, which just passed the state legislature. As of this recording, it's on Gavin Newsom's desk, right? Lots of people who were opposed to it were like, well, let us make the decisions at a local level, right? But I think that that's perhaps the most insidious of all of the things that we've talked about here that people believe and slash want to happen here. And you might be like, why is that? Why is that the most insidious? Well, it comes down to the basic problem at the heart of this view, in my opinion, is that it presupposes that people should be able to pull the ladder up behind them. It assumes that getting there first is a good enough reason for these people to have the ability to exclude anyone who wants to come in after them. And given what we know about how class inequalities map onto racial inequalities, map onto generational inequalities, that means that you got a lot of old people who are basically saying, I don't want anyone who is younger, poorer, or non-whiter than me to be able to move into my neighborhood. And we're acting as though that is a valid belief for them to have, something that the city government should take seriously and institute policy in order to make sure that it happens. And also, I think this just gets at a question at the heart of local representation and democracy. This, just by construction, just by its very nature as a procedure, means that people who would most benefit from a different policy, from a policy that allows for growth and housing and businesses and parks and schools and everything that we've been talking about, from more transit infrastructure, from better public services, from all of this, simply do not get a formal voice in the policymaking process and are legally not entitled to one. I think it's a thorny question, right, about the proper level for these decisions to be made, as well as sort of the temporal nature of a policymaker's responsibilities. But I think that our current policy landscape, right, basically allows politicians and incumbent residents to be empowered to prevent future people from becoming their constituents and neighbors. They have got there first, and they are practicing a politics of exclusion, and then they argue on the basis of democratic control, on the basis of local control, that they should have a right to continue excluding people from the policymaking process. And I think that we just have to extremely strongly reject this last premise in particular. We have to reject the idea that cities are only for people who were born there and that they cannot accommodate new arrivals. I think that this is fundamental to the idea of what cities are and what they can do for individuals and society. And I really, really think that our current political economy is basically fucking everything.
Well, and we know that the incentives for people when you have local control are to preserve, quote unquote, the value of their own property. And they will try to exclude anything that they think decreases the value of their property. Local control is the world's worst way to solve a collective action problem, which fundamentally is what this is.
Mm-hmm.
To say, down to the neighborhood, down to the block, you can object to some sort of use of the property in your neighborhood. There will never be anything undesirable but necessary built in a city again.
Mm-hmm.
And that just won't work for us for our future.
There will always be a handful of people in any neighborhood, any census tract, any census block or block group. Pick your level of geography, right? And as long as it's bigger than like a single house, you will be able to find someone in that unit of geography who thinks, we don't need that. We don't need to build that here. And as we've talked about several times in this podcast, imbuing our society with a heckler's veto is a terrible, terrible strategy for like its long-term survival, its long-term growth, its long-term change, so on and so forth. But I think it's probably about time for us to take a break here. So why don't we take a break from ranting about people who hate transplants? And when we come back, we will tell you why we actually should embrace transplants, and you know why that is a better situation than what we're doing right now. All right, everyone, welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. When we left, we were telling you all of the things that people believe about transplants and all of the things that they want to happen. In this back half of the show, we're going to talk about why, instead of all of that, we should embrace transplants, we should recognize them as an important part of the fabric of our cities, and just more generally, why transplants are actually good in our view. And are something to be welcomed rather than some people, I suppose we should say, some ones to keep out of your city. There are like any number of reasons that I could espouse here. I've been thinking about this for a long time. Megan can tell you that this has been sort of like a forbidden episode topic that we've been circling around for a while. But I'm going to try to limit myself to just a few reasons here. I think first and foremost, as we were talking about in the front half, there is like just a fundamental question of fairness here, right? Like, no, I do want to state, like up front in the first instance, that there are indeed good and bad reasons to move to a place. Some transplants can be good transplants or bad transplants, like good new neighbors or bad new neighbors. But I really don't think that like governments or people, frankly, should be in the business of adjudicating those reasons at all. right? Like, to give you an example here, Megan and I were sharing a couple stories over the break. The one that I has my for those of you who've been listening for a while, you maybe listened to the episode where my literal actual mom came on the show. She's a Presbyterian minister. She was the pastor at a small church, one of those that like exists in like older neighborhoods of cities that's like really just dropped right in the middle of a neighborhood, right? Even while we were living there, early 2000s, it was probably more than 100 years old. It probably came from like either the very, very beginning of the 20th or the very end of the 19th century. So it had been there for a very long time. And the neighbor that abutted the parking lot of the church, probably a man in his like 40s or 50s. I don't know. I was 8 at the time, right? 7 or 8. So like he could have been 30 for all I know. And like, I just thought he was older as a young child.
This is not a 30-year-old man complaint as the story progresses.
Yeah, as someone who is near 30 at this point, which is like a shuddering thing to say to myself. Yeah, for those of you who are watching online, you'll know why I laughed. For those who are listening, Megan just sent me a withering glance.
You'll be fine.
So this man who like abutted the parking lot came on more than one occasion, I think, if I'm remembering right, to complain to my mom about the fact that there was noise happening at the church on Sunday. This guy basically said, like, what I really like on Sunday is to just sit on my back patio with my coffee and just, be there listening to the sounds of nature. And there's just so much noise coming from the church on Sunday mornings, and I can't really enjoy my time on my back patio. And my mom said some variation on, unless you are a lot older than you look, the church was here when you moved in. Right? Like the church had been there probably conservatively for 3/4 of a century before this man bought that particular house, right? Why this man bought a house next to a church and then was annoyed by the noise coming from the church, I couldn't tell you. Why people who sometimes move to cities don't want there to be city happening, I couldn't tell you. But I do think that despite this man being annoying, my mom would tell you, the congregants would tell you, and I will tell you right now that I don't think that man should have been prohibited from moving into the neighborhood just because I find his subsequent actions to be a little bit distasteful, right? And the fact is that I think this kind of story is notable and interesting because it's rare, because it's not the norm. Most people who move to a new place are just moving to a new place to like be regular old citizens. You know what I mean? Like, we largely have a good handle on why people move to new places in the first place. The top 3 reasons for moving, in this order, are economic opportunity, family reasons, which is usually to move back, to be closer to family, or to follow family if family have moved, or to, this is, I think, a little bit wishy-washy, but this is how the reports define it, to improve their life course or health and safety. So, I can understand this. It includes a lot of reasons, but think someone moving from like an area that has some like environmental contaminants, someone who's moving from a higher crime area to a lower crime area, so on and so forth. That's sort of the blanket umbrella term for those like quality of life reasons, right? And so, if your opinion, based on these like isolated anecdotes that are notable precisely because they are rare, is that people should not be allowed to move to a new place. In effect, the odds are, because these 3 reasons for moving make up like 75% plus of all the reasons that people move, odds are that you are arguing they should not be allowed to seek better employment, better education, a better place to raise a family, to improve their health and safety, to escape bad situations, so on and so forth. You're basically arguing that they should not be allowed to improve their station in life, right? Like, as they see improving their station in life. And especially, I think, in recent years and recent months, right, with red states going after people's rights, particularly vulnerable people's rights, the ability of those people to escape those bad situations, for lack of better terms, I think escape is an actually apt term here, to more tolerant cities on the coasts that have more economic opportunity, that are more expensive because people want to live there. Allowing these people to escape red states to these places ought to be a substantial priority for folks. And if you don't think that's a valid reason for someone to move, then you might just be an enormous jackass. But
we shouldn't be in the business of adjudicating people's reasons at all. It's, I think, very easy to come up with an extremely sympathetic story about why people would want to move from, a red state or from a more conservative area where they don't feel personally safe, if that's their situation, or from a high crime area to a safer area, if that's their personal situation. But also, I think it's completely reasonable for someone who is pursuing economic opportunities. Like, if you want to move to a city where there's a high proportion of exotic dancers because that's the best way you can think of to make money, you should be able to do that too.
Yeah. If you're someone who just wants to move to Los Angeles because you like the beach and you want to live in Santa Monica, then you should be able to do that. And we should have policies in place that allow for housing, infrastructure, and public services to get built in order for people to do that. And I think this is sort of like where the policy comes into this second half, right? Which is that this used to be how American cities worked, right? Like, American cities were not encased in amber. They built up and out, right? Like, the idea that there would be the possibility of a housing crisis is like a relatively new phenomenon. And it really does come down to what Megan mentioned in the first half of the episode of like people deliberately lowering housing production in order to protect the speculative value of their assets. Like, yeah, they're homeowners, right? They want the place that they moved to or grew up in to stay the way that they've always liked it, right? There's I think, clear case for that being an actual motivation. But like, the economic motivation for exclusion is incredibly strong. And I don't think that we should be terribly surprised that if we built an entire economy, or at least built people's retirements on the idea that their house would always increase in value, that they would have an incentive to make sure that it increases in value as fast as possible and with the lowest risk of it not increasing in value. It's just like, it's so obvious in retrospect that setting up this system where people's primary residence is also their primary asset was a terrible idea. And we're reaping the rewards of that strategy. Meager as they are, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're rewards in the sarcastic sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also, just to wrap up this point on fairness and like whether we should be adjudicating people's reasons or local control or any of this. I saw one of the reasons that we're also late here is that Megan and I were both at the American Political Science Association annual conference last week, up in Vancouver, Canada. Do not ask me why the American Political Science Association decided to hold its annual meeting in Canada. They did. And I saw a very interesting paper be presented there by Tyler Simcoe and Alexander Son, who are professors at University of Michigan and University of North Carolina, respectively. They do a lot of housing work. They're interested in that kind of thing, and they run this survey where they use the emails that people submitted public comments under to the San Francisco Planning Commission. And then they go on, they survey those people directly. This is something that's like tricky to do, right? Finding people, like surveying people who attend public meetings. And they ask them various questions. And one of the questions that they ask them is, do you feel like you were listened to in the process, right? Do you feel like members of the Planning Commission listened to you and took you seriously? I don't remember the exact phrasing of this question, but it was something along those lines. And basically the only factor, like the determinative factor in whether or not they believe they were listened to, is whether or not they got what they wanted. Whether or not the Planning Commission made a decision at the end of the day that agreed with the comment that they made that they wanted to happen. And this, to me, I think, indicates very, very strongly that they don't actually have process concerns. They don't actually care about like local control, local voice. It's not an actual question of like democracy. It's a question of them getting what they want, and they believe that bringing more people into the process will make that less likely. And as we talked about in the front half, there's like, I think, a fundamental contradiction in local control and quality of democracy here, where the idea of local control presupposes that people should be able to pull up the ladder behind them. And I just don't think that's a great way to run our cities. And so, I think this is a good transition point into the second reason here, which is that our cities really just simply like would not be what they are without transplants. Like they wouldn't, right? I just want you to like attempt, like just imagine, right? Like what New York City would be without an Italian American community, without a Jewish American community, without the communities in Harlem and Spanish Harlem. Like, try to imagine Chicago without Polish or Italian neighborhoods, without the South Side. Like, imagine San Francisco without like Asian immigrants, Los Angeles or San Diego or San Antonio or Austin or Dallas or any of the cities really in the Southwest without Mexican folks, Miami without Cubans. Like, I could go on here, right? Like I could keep going on. But like, you get the idea, right? Like,
it is what makes cities interesting.
It is what makes cities interesting.
What creates the narrative of some of the best cities in America. The idea that you move to New York or you move to LA to pursue your dreams is a classic in this country.
Yeah, and we used to make movies about it, and we were like, this is a good thing, right? And now it feels like a lot of our media has to like do this sort of like sidestep where they're like, oh God, the main character's moving to a city. Like, let's hope she doesn't do anything untoward, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's not a celebratory thing anymore. Anyway.
No, now it's a trope. It's like getting a short haircut when you break up with a guy.
Yeah, precisely. And so I think, like, you know, as we mentioned at the top half, in the front half of the episode, transplants families become the born and raised in the subsequent generations. And unless you are Native American, you are the descendant of a type of transplant. In almost...
Those populations were mobile too.
Sorry?
Those populations moved around too.
Yeah, but like, you know, that's a little bit neither here nor there.
I think Native American populations were not nearly...
Yes, I understand the point you're making, but that's sort of neither here nor there. Like, the point that I'm making is, unless you are Native American, you ought to recognize that you were afforded an opportunity by virtue of your ancestors' ability to move. Now, obviously, we also should note here that like this is different in many ways for a lot of African Americans, but you know, for the vast majority of people in this country, especially for white Americans, who are more often than not, I think, people who rail against transplants, y'all were transplants too at one point, very much so. And you should recognize again that, like, in effect, what you are arguing is that you should be allowed to pull the ladder up behind you. And I think it's just bad. It just results in cities that aren't as cool, aren't as dynamic, don't have the same kinds of opportunities for people. Like, them's just the breaks, right? Like, if you're a successful city that has opportunity, people are going to want to move there. And like, if your family did the same, then you got to like, shut the fuck up, Buttercup, right? Like, get comfortable with the idea that like, get comfortable with the idea that people are going to take advantage of the same opportunities you did. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, if you live in a place where people want to move, congrats, you live in a cool place. Like, yeah. What is this? You know?
Yeah, and you need to get comfortable with the idea that people are going to take advantage of the same opportunities that your family took advantage of, right? And also, like, you know, understand that much like DJ Khaled, you are suffering from success. It's my best joke of the entire episode.
Okay.
Clearly my best joke was, what the fuck do you mean, Earl? Anyway. All right. Moving right along here. I think third, this anti-transplant mentality, I would argue, is actively harmful for people's incomes and for society's like long-term growth. An anti-transplant mentality, I would argue, is an anti-growth mentality. And I don't mean this in like the pop psych, you gotta have a growth mentality sort of way. I mean this like very directly in like a per capita GDP economic sense. It is an anti-economic growth mentality.
It's not
And
about grind set.
yeah, and that's because we know that cities are just like the fundamental engines of modern economies. This is not particularly in dispute in like modern economics literature. There's like agglomeration effects. There's the effects of what are called, and I hate the fact that this is the term, thick labor markets, as opposed to thin labor markets. Don't love the terminology, but that's what they've gone with.
ICK or ICC? She thick.
I hate you so much. Anyway, but like
you're never going to be able to think about this phrase again.
Literally, yeah, thick labor market. Geez, just the labor market is twerking. Yeah. So collecting myself here a little bit. The long story short is that there's more innovation that happens in cities, right? This is like the basic idea of an agglomeration effect. There's the spatial proximity of people and businesses from different places. The fact that, moving in and of itself often selects for people who are more innovative or talented or hardworking on average.
Or comfortable with risk.
Or comfortable with risk taking, right? Like the fact that you have all of these people coming together in cities, or like you're supposed to have all of these people coming together in cities, contributes to economic growth and makes people's lives better. And these, like, for lack of a better term, I guess, like wheels of progress really do grind to a halt when you say that people should not be able to move to places with the most economic opportunity. And the scale of these effects, at least as we have like attempted to measure them, is like really quite large. There's a paper by Chengte Sieh, Sieh, at the University of Chicago, and then Enrico Moretti at UC Berkeley, both of whom are like well-respected labor economists. And if you know anything about the arguments and debates between the University of Chicago and UC Berkeley, the fact that these two economists are working together on this should maybe tell you a little bit. They find that housing constraints, which have limited the ability of people to move to places where they would have been able to make the best use of their skills, what they call spatial misallocation, has reduced, or between their study period, reduced aggregate economic growth by 36% from 1964 to 2009. And the size of that difference, as like, interpolated out into wages using some like models of how much of that growth would have gone to increase wages versus capital and all that, is equivalent roughly to the average worker making $8,775 less today than if there were none of this spatial misallocation. The average salary in the United States is nearly $10,000 lower a year because we don't let people live where they want to, because we have this level of spatial misallocation. And as we keep harping on here, the biggest reason for this really is that people have these exclusionary attitudes and choose not to let more stuff get built. It really is. That's like the fundamental reason here. It's what I got. It's what I got on this point. It's just disheartening. Yeah. There's nothing more to say about it.
It's super frustrating. It's super frustrating to know. And that's one of those things that I wonder if that sort of data being presented to folks who want to be able to exclude different uses of land in cities, or who want to exclude new people from coming into their communities, I wonder if that would move the needle at all. Because I always find it's this like very strange logical, it's not a fallacy, it's a misstep in the logic to say, someone coming into my community will only bring economic negatives. Someone coming into my community has more money to spend. Someone coming into my community drives up demand. So for real estate, so if I already own a home, that is actually increasing the value of my property, not decreasing it. What is driving the belief that new people coming into communities create economic drawbacks, not economic benefits? I would love to know a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest things is that people, much as they may protest otherwise, just don't like change. They just don't. They view change as the negative. They view these like frictional things as negative as well, right? Like, because housing construction and like road construction, infrastructure, all that can be quite irritating when it's happening,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I guess there's also just this like in-group out-group sort of mentality, right? Like the city is your in-group, people who are moving into the out-group. There's less research though specifically on like all of the dynamics of people like opposing housing and all this. Some of my research suggests part of it is racially motivated. One of the papers I presented last week suggests that this is the case. Another piece of it, to the first part of your question, is that a lot of people just like seem to not understand that building more housing reduces prices. Like there's a recent paper that looks at like how people react to supply shocks, right? So like it presents them with a bunch of different like supply shocks. There's one that's like plumbers. There's one that's like new car supply chain on like the price of old cars, right? Which is, I think, directly analogous, right, to like not building new housing on the price of existing housing, right? And in all of these cases, except for housing, people are like very like the majority or plurality of people are directionally correct about what happens when you have that kind of supply shock. And when it comes to new housing, more people are like the plurality of people are directionally wrong. The plurality of people think that building new housing increases housing prices. And I think that is probably a really clear reason why people think that there's these negatives that are brought about by newcomers moving in. I haven't seen any work that directly informs people of like the economic consensus on this. Might be an interesting thing for me to do.
Yeah, there you go. Paper idea.
But my intuition is that a lot of them simply won't believe it. And you'd have to like do quite a lot of educating. And this is just like something that I know from making videos on this for a long time. I can present people with 10 minutes worth of information about like the economic consensus on this, and I will still get comments from people who are like, but you haven't considered this thing that I actually do consider at minute 7 in the video and you just didn't get there, right? I don't know. Broadly speaking, I am pessimistic. I'm a little pessimistic about the ability of information to change people's minds on this one. A little annoying, but could be worth a shot. There are also people who have told me in the comments that I have changed their minds, so that's worth it, I guess. But there are also lots of people who like just seem like who seem like doctrinaire and religious about this, quite frankly. There's like a certain like article of faith type taking that happens for a lot of people who are like, well, you can't possibly like address this problem by like having people make money doing the thing that would be beneficial. Anyway, that's the long story short of it. It's a little
It doesn't count. If you do it to make money, it doesn't count.
Yeah. And then fourth and finally, I think it's important to note that pro-city policy is pro-climate and pro-environment policy. When people move to cities, they are almost always moving from places that have a higher climate impact. From the suburbs to a city, from a state with a like dirtier energy mix to a state with a cleaner energy mix. When people can't move to these places that have lower climate environmental impacts, when they can't move to places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, New York, Boston, like pick your favorite one of these places, right? They move to places that have substantially higher climate impacts and environmental impacts. Places like Dallas or Atlanta or Phoenix or Las Vegas or Charlotte, right? Places that are sprawling out into like the urban wildland interface. Places that are, like gobbling up all of the best farmland, making us use more fertilizers and more water and all that kind of stuff. When they move to exurbs instead, like they drive more, they have higher carbon emissions, right? Like the evidence on this point, I think, is actually super, super clear and like really worth remarking on, that people who live in cities, despite the fact that the city itself has like less nature in it than your typical suburb, right, have a much smaller carbon footprint than people living in suburbs, and they take up like less natural space. Because prior to the suburb getting built there, that was all natural space, right? And when you have these suburbs and exurbs extend out into the urban wildland interface, you get things that are like forest fires, people are displaced more often, yada, yada, yada. I could go on this point, but,
This is a generational thing, I think, as much as anything. So as you get your stereotype of a urban dweller who doesn't want anything else built, is usually an older person, and older folks came of age in an environmentalism movement that prioritized green space. And so that tends to kind of merge with cities bad and urban green space good. And so that can lead to some really weird and inefficient allocations of space within cities. Don't preserve a vacant lot because it's a green space, put some housing on it and use it better.
Yeah, it also comes out of like that same environmentalism, like it was consumption that was bad, right? And anything that looks like consumption is bad. And so building apartments is worse than building homes because there's more consumption that's happened there, right? Like it takes more resources to build that one apartment building than the one home, but people aren't connecting that actually in order to replace that apartment building, you're actually getting part of a subdivision out in Victorville, right?
Is it going this way or is it going that way? It's like deciding to buy in bulk or not.
Yeah.
Like, yes, it's a bigger container of peanut butter if you buy this rather than this, but there's only the one jar rather than a whole bunch of jars.
Yeah. And so the upshot of this last point here is that basically when people can't move to a city because the people that hate transplants there have decided to exclude them, they move to places that set back our climate efforts. They move to exurbs. They move to states that have a dirtier energy mix, that don't get as much of their power from wind and hydroelectric and solar and all that. They move to places where they're going to have a bigger climate impact just by virtue of existing, right? Through no fault of their own, even if they change none of their behavior deliberately, they are going to have a higher climate impact in these places.
If you move to Phoenix rather than Portland, you're running an air conditioner 11 months a year.
Yeah.
It's just how it's going to be.
It just is how it be. With the long story short of all of this being, letting people move is good, and we should do it more often. But until we manage to do that, until we can sort of reorient ourselves away from this conception of building as a negative, of cities bad, of transplants are only a negative for my community, until we can get ourselves into a new reference frame where we want our cities to be dynamic, we want people to be able to seek the opportunity there. Until we do those things, I have been Clayton Becker.
I have been Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys on the next one.